Manousso Musing with conflict coach Pattie Porter, author of Stop Avoiding Drama and Stop the Dreaded Drama 55 Tips for Ending Destructive Conflict. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Ołowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland, also certified as a Supreme Court of Florida family mediator.
And I'm Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manousso. I am a practitioner in mediation, arbitration, as well as a trainer based in Houston, Texas, and Newport, Rhode Island. And I am just delighted today to have on Manousso Musing Pattie Porter. And Pattie Porter is very well known on a federal level, local level, international level as a conflict coach. And one of her other talents, which is quite large, is that she has written some mini books. And Pattie, welcome to our program today. And we're interested in hearing about two of your books, Stop the Dreaded Conflict. That starts a nice drama with 55 tips for ending destructive conflict, and also your book, Stop Avoiding Conflict. So I know that both of these books offer wisdom and give opportunity for people to examine their conflicts. So let's talk about why you wrote the books, but let's start with the one that says Stop the Dreaded Drama. I think people can really identify with that. And then we'll transition and talk a little bit about Stop Avoiding the Conflict, which is another book that you have. So welcome, Pattie Porter from San Antonio, Texas, our conflict coach for today. What made you write the book, Stop the Dreaded Drama?
That was my first book that I wrote. The reason I started writing that is so much of the conflict that I was invited to help in, especially in mediation, initially was a lot of the cases I would get, is that people were already in this drama in the workplace. And so I would come in and do a lot of mediation. And in these mediations, it was just like, there were so many things that people could have done way ahead of time before they ever got to this point in mediation. I remember someone saying to me that by the time people came into mediation, it was like they were coming into the emergency room in trauma and they're bleeding out to death, and now you're trying to save their life. And so that means, when you think about that in the workplace or family situation, is that the trust is eroded, the relationship is toxic. There's been so much damage in the relationship. Like, can we save this? And so I wrote the book to say, okay, if you're in this destructive conflict, what are some things that you can do to get out of that conflict, to stop participating in being in that drama? So there were 55 tips at looking at different ways, everything from before, during the conflict, and even after the conflict event had actually ended. Some of it was around actually participating in mediation and facilitation. So that was one of the reasons I started with that book first.
So amongst those 55 tips for ending those conflicts, can you tell us at least one that will be an incentive for the readers to buy the book, to read the book, and to apply those tips?
The first one is don't take the bait. And what I mean by that is, for those who love to fish, you throw out the bait and you wait for the fish to grab the line. And the thing is when the fish grabs the line, you're fighting the fish, and the fish is trying to get off, and you're trying to reel it in. And I say, when people throw out, whether they're triggering you, they're purposely trying to manipulate you, don't take the bait. Don't get on the line, because you're then contributing to, right, the destructive drama. So the first thing is get off the line, right? Don't take the bait. Stop your part in that behavior, and don't continue to engage in that toxic relationship.
Yes, and I'll share my screen again. If you are listening to this, be sure to check out the website endingdestructiveconflict.com. That is where you can check them both out, or you can, of course, watch the YouTube version of this recording and see it here. But one thing I do see, Patty, is that you also have these as audio on Audible as well. And I noticed on the um, Stop the Dreaded Drama version that you're the narrator. I'm always intrigued by whenever an author reads their own book, and so it will be kind of cool to hear that. So anyway, how about family mediations? I know your big focus is on workplace conflict, um, and that's like a work family kind of situation. But what about the actual biological family where there's conflict? There's a divorce situation, there's a custody battle between parents over kids. What are a few, I guess, bad habits that you see all the time, routine, that anybody who's watching this, who's looking for some kind of hope, some kind of tip, what are some things you could tell them to, hey, just stop that, and that would make your relationship a whole lot better?
Stop being reactive. The first thing is just stop and pause before you react to something that you're hearing. And that's so hard to do because we get into these old patterns or these old dance steps, right? It's like you're in the same dance over and over again, and it's not working. Stop the dance. You've got to learn a completely different dance. So the first thing is that a lot of times when people aren't feeling heard and understood, the more they try to insert their opinion or insert their position, and then they're not listening to each other. So just stop and pause, and then just try to be in a place of listening to what the other person is saying. And before you launch into your point of view, acknowledge. And I don't mean say like, I understand where you're coming from, or okay, I understand. Don't do that. What I want you to do is to acknowledge what I heard you say was important, is that we work together on our finances so that we're in agreement about what the understanding is, what the boundaries are around our spending, right? So you want to be able to acknowledge by saying what the key points are. Then you can start to talk a little bit about your point of view, but you've got to do your part to make sure the other person feels heard and understood and valued for having a voice.
Hattie, what was one of the big takeaways that you would like us to uh, really understand about the stop avoiding conflict? What is something? What's the one big takeaway? You gave us some good information right now, um, that for people not to take the bait, not to reel it in, not to make that a quick response so that you're escalating your conflict. But I've read your books, and you write so well, and you really break it down for people and nurture the opportunity for people to have a self awareness. So what would be one more item that you might want to share with us?
Well, Stop Avoiding Conflict is the second mini book I wrote, and it's my favorite. And for me, I am myself a recovering conflict avoider. I grew up learning not to have a voice. I grew
Mhm.
up in a very high conflict family myself. And so learning to survive in a very high conflict family meant not having a voice. When I became a young adult, I thought not having a voice, making the peace, making sure everyone got along and no one's feelings were hurt was the best way to have a healthy relationship. And I quickly found out that that was not the case. And I would allow things to build up inside of myself until I exploded. And that's why I have the volcano on the book, because so many people in organizations and in relationships avoid those tough conversations. They're afraid. And so I want people to know that avoiding conflict is a choice and it's an approach. And if we use that habitually, that can be very toxic to relationships. And people will often be like, well, how is it toxic to avoid the conflict? And I remember I did this mediation training, and there was a woman in the class. She was probably in her maybe late 50s, early 60s. And she was introducing herself, and she says, my husband and I have been married 27 years. And we're like, oh, great. And then no more than probably 30 minutes into the training, oh, and she said, and my husband and I have never had conflict. And about 30 minutes, 45 minutes into the training, she says, oh, my husband and I are getting a divorce, but they never had conflict. What that
Right.
told me is they have conflict all over the place. They just weren't talking about it. They were
Mhm.
avoiding it for 27 years until it just was too much. So, yes, you're having conflict. Just because you're avoiding it doesn't mean it's not there. It's definitely there. So, for me as a conflict avoider recovering, the first thing I had to learn is to have courage to have a voice, courage to know how to say what I needed to say without it going the opposite pendulum, right? I was learning to have a voice, and my pendulum swung to the place where I was aggressive and abrasive and what I wanted and what I needed, even when I went to the restaurant and say, my steak is not cooked the way I want it, send it back. And then it was just like
Sure.
way too aggressive. So I had to learn what courage meant for me, to be able to speak up and have a voice. Then I needed to feel confident about having these conversations, these difficult conversations, to be assured, to, be clear in my voice, be confident in my voice, and not threatening to the other person. And then I had to learn to be competent in my skills in dealing with difficult conversations. I would say the biggest tip here is checking my assumptions. We have these stories that we tell ourselves about the other person's motive or their intent. And usually it's very, very negative. We don't really start to think about them as human beings, because if we have a protracted conflict, we see them as the enemy or we see them as this bad person. But really, they're not a bad person. It's just we keep telling ourselves this story. It keeps generating a negative emotion for us, and then we act in ways that is based on the story we tell ourselves, and we actually show up not in a good way. And so I would say, check your story, check your self talk. What are you saying to yourself about that situation or person? What could be another way of thinking about that situation and person that starts to neutralize the strong emotion you're feeling? And then start to be clear about what your intent is and how you show up in that relationship. So if you say, my intention is to be professional and respectful, whether that's in the workplace or to be loving and respectful to my spouse, and then you get in a tough conversation and they're acting in ways that aren't loving and respectful or professional respectful, and then you start to default, right, to being toxic. And I remember coaching two individuals, one individual in particular, and she said, my intent is to be professional, respectful, regardless of what the other person does. Well, the person acted in ways that wasn't professional, respectful. And then later in a second coaching session, she said, She says, well, if she's not acting professional and respectful, then I'm not. And I said to her, so let me just be a mirror for you. I'm hearing you say that the reason you're being professional, respectful is conditional to what somebody else does. And as soon as I said that, she goes, no, my intent is to be professional, respectful. I said, so it's not conditional. So how can you still behave in alignment with your intent? So that would be the other thing is what is your intent? And stick to your intent. Make sure your behavior is aligned with your intent.
So, Patty, what does that mean? What is your intent? I'm not quite clear. When somebody's in an argument, your intent is just to get them back, um, to be the victor over them. But I have a feeling that you mean something a little bit softer
Yes.
for what is the intent. What might that look like, please?
Well, okay, so let's take your example then. If the intent is to be the victor and to win this argument, then guess what? You're probably going to have pretty negative results. I mean, you might win the argument, but in the long term, you might lose the relationship or you damage the relationship. If your intent is, I love my spouse and I want to be respectful. I want him to be or she to be respectful and loving back to me. Then what do I do in my behavior and what I say and what I do to show loving and respect to build that in that relationship and not make it conditional? Or if I'm in the workplace, my intent is that I really want the person I'm directing, that I'm supervising to be successful. And so I know this is being a tough conversation. So it's not about me winning my point of view as the supervisor, but really I want that person to be successful. So I've got to keep a clear intent in mind so that I don't lose sight of that in the conversation. Like, what's the long term result I'm looking for here? And keep that in mind.
And that's what you help as the conflict coach. You help them identify with that because I would expect that a lot of people wouldn't realize being able to have the vision going beyond what's happening in that moment.
Yes.
And thank you so much, Patty, for your background story, because what really is magnetizing always about the books is when you can see a personal experience that is bringing an author to give certain tips. And I understand that you have this experience both personally and professionally. And actually, I identify with you so much because I am a conflict avoider myself. And recently, I came up with another idea. To avoid conflict, you can most easily avoid the person. But sometimes it is not possible to avoid the person that you're in conflict with. And I also believe that there are certain triggers, and I think that these would be the triggers for men. And I wanted to challenge you to answer this question. When a woman comes to a man and says, we need to talk, this is a trigger for a man to immediately start getting into defense mode because
Hair
they
goes up.
perceive it as an attack. So how can we? Actually, that would also work with the boss, right? When your boss in the workplace comes to you and come to my office. We need to talk. You see that there is like a ready-made pattern for a conflict to develop. What is the easiest way to handle yourself well in a situation like that that is most likely to result in something very unpleasant?
Now, are you saying as the receiver or as the person initiating?
As the person who is being challenged with these words, meaning, come on,
So,
we need to talk.
yes, yes. So, well, first of all, I think when you're approaching whether you're, again, a family member or your boss and you're like, we need to talk, I think the first thing is you need to know the person well enough to know that that is a potential trigger for them. And so how do you then change that? So my husband, Robert, is also a conflict avoider. And if I came to him, because I've learned to be much more confident about approaching difficult conversations with him, and if I were to say, we need to talk, he's already shutting down. his defense mechanism is shutting down. Some people, men's defense mechanism is already, we're ready to fight. Like, what do you mean? We're not going to talk, or okay, let's come in here and talk about it, right? So it could be either way. So I've learned with Robert, I can't approach it that way. I might ask the question, there's an issue that we've been grappling with for a while, and when would be a good time for us to talk about it? Just sit down and calmly talk about it. So I asked the question, instead of saying we need to talk, when would be a good time to talk about this issue? Now, some people are like, never would be a good time to talk about this issue. Right? And then it becomes, if never is a good time to talk about this issue, it's going to be an ongoing issue that's going to impact our relationship. I want you to think about when you want to come to me, when you're ready. I don't want you to feel threatened. My intent here we go with the intent. My intent is for us to talk about it calmly. My intent is to really understand where you're coming from. My intent is to not, take a position or to win this argument. It's just really, let's have a dialogue about it. And so when you're ready, let me know, and then have a great morning, honey, or boss. When you're ready, I'd like for us to have that conversation. So those might be some things that I do, knowing who that person is.
Yeah. And Patty, who would you say is the best audience for these kind of books? Would it be the typical conflict avoider? Would it be a boss who has to deal with difficult subjects with employees? Would it be an employee maybe? What do you think?
Well, the Stop Avoiding Conflict, I wrote these books for the everyday person. So I wrote that in mind for the everyday person who really struggles with conflict. On the Stop Avoiding Conflict, I purposely wanted to make sure I included all kinds of scenarios. I have the family scenarios, I have the work scenarios with bosses, employees, I have the neighbor scenarios, I think I said family scenarios. So there's a lot, and the scenarios that are in this book are based on personal experiences, either my own personal experiences or experiences from coaching or mediation, friends who've told me stories. So these are all real scenarios that are in the Stop Avoiding Conflict. And then it talks about the strategy. So yes, this is for the everyday person.
Pattie, you're wonderful as a conflict coach, as a mediator, and as an adjunct professor. We want to thank on Manousso Musing having Pattie Porter, author of Stop Avoiding Conflict. Thank you for sharing your stories. And conflictconnections.com. Lots of wonderful information. Thank you, Pattie Porter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.